Hi everyone, this is InDesign 1, and this is the second webcast of week 7. Sorry about the abrupt end to the webcast 1. Hopefully little beeps have stopped. I went back and listened and it looks like it did carry through, but I wasn't sure if it was going to continue. I kept getting warning beeps, so I thought it'd be better to be safe than sorry. Alright, we're going to move directly to the place we were at the end of webcast 1. Which is starting to work with the gap tool. We had gone through and created a series of images in a grid format, and I've got 6 of them here, or 9 of them here. And I want to go back and just review a couple of minutes where we were at the end of the previous webcast. So I had introduced the gap tool, which is this tool here underneath the direct selection tool. And as I mentioned in the previous webcast, you aren't looking for any selected object, which I think is a little counterintuitive because you think that whatever you need to adjust should be selected because that's the way it typically is in InDesign. But in this case I don't have anything selected on the page, and as I drag, or I should say as I move my mouse around and I'm hovering over a gap, the gap tool is identifying that gap and highlighting what would be impacted if I click my mouse or I hold my mouse button down and I drag. And I'm not sure if the webcast is picking up the darkened area, the shaded area, but I think you can definitely see the double arrows with the black line. And here we have highlighted the horizontal gap between the top 3 pictures and the second row of pictures. So let's just go through these different keyboard equivalents we see here so that you can see the impact that each one of these makes. Just starting from the beginning, I've got this entire gap which separates the third column, the second column, and the third column. If I press my mouse button down and I drag, it moves that gap over into the direction that I dragged. And I drag to the right, and as far as I drag, you can see that it moves it. And as I mentioned before, the photos are resizing because these particular images had the auto fit checkbox turned on. So each one of these, if I just drag over the top of them, you can see that all of them have AutoFit turned on. And AutoFit is going to use the last fitting command that was applied to these images, which was fill content proportionally. And remember the difference between fill content proportionally and fit content proportionally is that the fit content proportionally fits the entire image in the frame. And if the image is the wrong proportion, then it fits the largest part of it, so there's going to be white space. What happens when you fill a frame proportionally is that you're going to see that the shortest part of the image is going to size exactly to the frame, which means that much of this, or could be a little bit of it, gets cropped out. If I hold down this eagle here, and I move it, you can see that that eagle sitting looking over his shoulder is much bigger than what can fit in this frame. But fill frame proportionally is very popular because you get a nice clean edge and you can force images to fit into frames when you are definitely trying to create some sort of a pattern. All right, I'm going to undo that by pressing Control-Z. And I want to move to this next keyboard equivalent. If you shift drag, you are going to restrain the movement of the gap tool to the objects that are nearest your mouse cursor. So I'm going to go back to the gap tool. I'm going to select this exact same gap, but this time I'm going to hold down the Shift key. The Shift key is going to isolate that movement to just those 2 images that are on either side of the gap tool. So I get something like this. The Shift key throughout this entire series of alternating keyboard equivalents is always going to be the key that restrains the movement of any gap or any movement of the images to just those images that are closest to the gap tool. If I hold down either the Control key or the Command key, Command on the Mac and Control again on Windows, it resizes the gap instead of moving it. So let's try that one. My gap tool is highlighting this exact same area, but this time instead of just dragging, I'm going to hold down either the Control or the Command key, and as I drag, notice that the gap gets larger, and it's pushing those images, actually it's resizing the images so that they are further apart. I'm going to bring that back in really tight. Hold this for a moment, let it refresh so you guys can see this. Okay. Bring it back out a little bigger. And I'm going to undo that again by pressing Control V. And let's do this again, but this time I'm going to add the Shift key. Remember, the Shift key is going to restrain it to those images closest to the gap tool. So I'm holding down my Control or my Command key, and then I'm going to add my Shift key. And as I move my mouse away from the gap, it increases the size of the gap, but it's only impacting these two images. So the Control or the Command key is changing the size of the gap instead of moving it. And now we're going to move to this next set, which uses the Alt or the Option key, again depending on what operating system you're working with. This moves the gap and objects in the same direction. So let's try this again. My gap tool is over the exact same gap, but this time I'm going to hold down either my Alt or my Option key. And as I move, notice that every image that borders that gap moves together as a unit. So the gap is moving, but it's moving all of the surrounding images with it, which is pretty interesting. Undo that. Hold down my Alt or my Option key again, but this time I'm going to add the Shift key once more, and only those images directly surrounding the gap tool end up getting moved. All right, now we're going to add the second method we talked about, the Control or the Command key, with the Alt or the Option key. So if you're on Windows, you would hold down both the Control and the Alt key. If you're on the Mac, you would hold down both the Command and the Option key. This is going to resize the gap and move the objects. So again, I'm going to place my cursor in the exact same position that I've been placing it each time before, so you get a direct comparison here. Hold down my Control Alt or my Option Command, and when I move, you can see that it's changing the size of the gap just like it did with the Control key, but instead of resizing the images, it's moving the images. Let me bring that back in. As I'm sure you can understand, the possibilities for this are absolutely endless. I mean, and the thing that's so wonderful about this is that it is saving you so much production time. It's just incredible. So I'm going to probably stay away from the Alt key, but I'm going to hold down the Shift key here. Let me undo that and just make a few changes. Actually, you know what? I want to size this. So I'm going to move, oops, move this one here, put the gap between the top and bottom here. So for the first time, I'm putting my cursor between two images that are above and below each other rather than right and left. I'm going to add that shift key. Whoops. Nope, I just want this to, let's put these away. Over here. And it's not as if this looks that great. In fact, it's pretty off. I would much rather have kept this outer border the same, but I just want to show you how I would like you to put out a grid of images, and then I would like you to just place your cursor between each of these gaps and play around with each of the options that we've talked about here. So don't forget, the Shift key is going to move the gap or whatever combination of keys you're using, but it's only going to use the two nearest objects. The Control and the Command key are going to resize the gap instead of moving it. And the Alt key and the Option key are going to move the gap and the objects rather than resizing the gap by taking that room out of the objects. And then the Control Alt or the Command Option is going to resize the gap and it's going to move the objects. All right, I'm going to undo this. And pull this over here. And then pull this over here. And maybe move this over here. What I love about this is that you can create a sense of kind of disproportion, but at the same time you have a sense of organization overlaying it. And I'm going to move down to a spread that I created right below this so that I can bring up a couple of other things. This is probably a slightly more realistic layout. Let me let that refresh. And this is one thing that I was confused about when I first started using the gap tool. I knew that the gap tool can recognize gaps across the spread, but I could not get it to work. It always stopped at the spread divider, the page divider. So I'm going to zoom out so you guys can see that these are two pages side by side. And the gap tool is going all the way across from this edge here, hope you guys can see this, all the way over to here. What makes that work is if something, some image or text box crosses over the page division. When I first started using this, I was trying to get it to select the gap. And I can zoom in now so you guys can see this a little bit better. And hold that still for just a moment until this refreshes. And can you see how the gap is dark going all the way across? And it's because these two images are crossing over this edge. So if I move this now, you see how it is modifying those images all the way across. And this is also going to be true about text boxes. I'm going to take this out of preview for just a moment so you can see that This is a text box here on the right page, a text box on the left page. I'm going to place my gap tool underneath one of these text boxes. That gap, I see that gray highlight going all the way across my spread. And the exact same thing is going to occur. Now it's interesting, it's not, oh right, because neither of these text boxes go all the way across. So what is allowing the gap tool to highlight, make this highlight going across is really this image that's going over the top, but it's not going to impact, notice it's not impacting the text on the left page. And if I move this gap tool over to the left page, let me undo that so we can highlight it. It's only going to impact the text on that left page. The edge of your page acts as an object when you're working with the gap tool. So for example, if I place my cursor over the top of this word adventure, you'll see that it's highlighting the gap between the top of the page and the word adventure. And if I drag this up, it's resizing the top of that text box. Now I have told this particular piece of text that it's supposed to align to the bottom of the text box, so we're not seeing any visual difference. But if instead I hover over the gap to the right of these two text boxes that are on the left-hand page, and notice that the gap tool is highlighting the space between the right edge of these two elements and the edge of the page. Remember, this is a spread, so it's two different pages. I have a left page and I have a right page, and this is the margin area. And as I resize this, you can see that the edge of the page is acting as if it were an object, that the gap was spanning the distance between these two. Let's try this over the top of this text box. I'm going to drag down. You can see that it's resizing that text box. And if I go back up the other direction, it's minimizing that gap so the text box is getting stretched up in a vertical direction. I can move these two elements and make these two smaller. And I may decide that I want that capital A, the left side of it, to align better against the image below it. So maybe I will drag that over to the right so that the far left edge of the capital A is going to be right above the image here. And hold down my Shift key and move this over here. And let that refresh. Decided I wanted that band underneath to be a little narrower. But maybe I don't want the images to stretch above it. So I'm going to undo that. And this time I'm going to hold down the Alt key. Let's try the Control key instead. You can see the gap is increasing. And decreasing. Okay. I can see that when I decrease the size of the text box here, I made it just small enough that the entire word adventure can't fit. We're going to be talking about this in I think that's our next webcast. We're going to be focusing on text frames. We see the red plus overflow. So I need to either change the size of this text. I need to compress it slightly. Maybe instead of it being bold, I make it semi-bold, or instead of semi-bold, I make it regular. I'm just going to track this a little bit tighter to make sure that it fits. And again, we'll be talking about many of those little features when we get talking about text frames and manipulating text within them. The lab that you'll be doing after last week's lab will be to create a 2-page, or I think maybe it's a 1-page flyer for, it's going to be something like an advertisement. And everything that we have talked about in this webcast and the previous one is going to come in really handy, because you're going to want to put several photos on the page, and I would imagine that you're going to want to try to create some sort of spacing between them. And this feature, both to gridify objects and to use the gap tool, will save you lots of time. But before you really dig into doing this lab, which I won't assign to the end of the week, and I know you have 2 weeks for the previous lab, so I don't want anyone to get stressed out about this next one being due, and I'll go over it Thursday night. I want you to try to spend some time after this webcast going through and, like I said, putting images on the page and then practicing with this. Make sure that if you are using images that you turn on AutoFit. So as the gap tool is changing the distance between these images, they will be resized and you won't get any weird gaps. Let me go up to let me go to this page here. I'm going to select these and turn AutoFit off. And now with the gap tool, I'm going to resize these. And immediately it becomes apparent that the frame gets sized, but not the image inside. I would have to then go back to my selection tool, click on the image, and either right-click or use my resize icon up here to resize the image to proportionally fill this frame. So you can see, if I do this several times here, how much more work you're going to have to do in order for these images then to fill those frames. I will go back and review the fitting commands in the next webcast. I'm going to be talking some more about graphic tools and graphic frames and importing, manipulating those frames. I just feel like it's real important for me to go back over those just because it's such an integral part of InDesign. All right. I think that is it for the gap tool and using the grid function. If anyone has any questions about this during the week, please post your questions to the blog or send me an email, because I don't mind reviewing any of this on Thursday. So hopefully you will have a chance to listen to these webcasts before our live lecture. And if anyone has any questions, again, please take advantage of the fact that you can even submit a question if you can't be at the live lecture, because it will then get recorded and you'll be able to hear it later. I also want to remind people that I am more than happy to answer any questions at office hours. No one really has taken advantage of that hour. And if that's not going to work in your schedule, I know I've sent out an email on this. Please let me know. Because even though I'm a full-time consultant, in addition to teaching this class, I know I can work at a time where I could set up a session with you where we could go through any questions that you have online. I'd rather get these things taken care of as they become problems so that you can just jump ahead and feel like you're keeping up and not having one frustration mount onto another. All right, practice, practice, practice. Until next time, signing off.